Hey guys, it's Rogaway here, and I am back with another tutorial. And today we are looking at Blender Part 2. And if you follow Part 1, we got into the basics of using Blender and creating objects, moving objects, rotating objects, scaling objects. And now we're going to go into the actual editing of the objects. So I'm going to just do a quick search for Blender on my machine here, load it up. And there we are, a brand new Blender document. Now, in order to be successful with Blender, or any 3D program for that matter, you need to be able to mold or model objects into recognizable objects. And up to this point, we just talked about primitives, and those are all under the Create menu here. And these are great starting points for more complicated objects. And so what we're going to look at today is how to actually go in and edit an object so that we can actually change its shape and start to modify it to look like something else. And so down here at the bottom, we've got the object mode, which is right now what we are in. It allows us to see objects, allows us to move objects. So if I press G, I can move it around. All right. And that's the object mode. But what we want to do is we want to actually go into this object and be able to change the shape of the object. And so what we need to do is we need to switch it from object mode into edit mode. There's also sculpt mode, which we'll talk about in another lesson. But edit mode, the shortcut for this is tab. So you press tab and it switches to edit mode. And now you see that the object becomes orange. Now in 3D, there are several very important parts of a mesh that you need to know about. And that is the vertices, which are these little points that connect different parts of a mesh together. There are edges, which connect the points together. All right, so between each point there is an edge. And then there is the face, which is an area surrounded by edges. These three parts are super important if you want to get into modeling and understanding how meshes and 3D objects are built. All right, now in edit mode, you will see that we have three options right here. Hopefully you can see that. We got vertice mode or vertex mode, edit or edge mode, and we've got face mode. So each one of these will allow us to select a different part. So right now I'm in vertex select, and I can click on any of the vertexes that I see. The next one is edge mode, and that will allow me to select the actual edges of the object. And face mode will allow us to select the faces. All right, so pretty self-explanatory, pretty easy. Now let's say we're creating something that is pretty complex, and we want to be able to select the points on the other side of this object. We could just spin our view, select it that way. All right, I'll switch back to vertex mode. Or what we could do is we could switch the display mode that we are looking at our object in. And in order to do that, where you see this solid circle right now, which is set to shaded or solid, we are going to switch to wireframe. A wireframe will show us the mesh in its raw form. Okay, so now we can actually select points that are on the back side of our object without having to worry about, not being able to see them when it's filled in with shading. So that's a handy little feature. Now you might be wondering, what's the point? Why are we wanting to select the points in the first place? Well, if I select a point or a vertex and I apply those same little tricks that I used with moving the object, such as G, for example, I can now move this one point out, and I can use that same trick with the X and the Y and the Z to affect or to change where that one point is in relationship to the rest of the mesh. All right, so you can see how I have taken that corner down and added or moved it to a new location. So that's pretty cool. Now we can do the same thing with edges and faces. And so for a face, for example, let's say we try scaling this face. You can see that that works exactly as it should. We can scale a single face, we can move points around, and we can start to mold or sculpt or model this mesh into something different. Now let's say we're creating something a little more complicated. And let's say at this point here, we need this piece to come up for whatever reason. Well, now what we need to do is we need to actually go in and add more vertices and edges to this object in order to be able to edit it further. And so what we can do is we can go into Tools, and we have a variety of tools that will do this. In my opinion, the easiest one to understand is Loop, Cut, and Slide. Shortcut, Control-R. So if you click that, you will see a purple line that will appear either vertically or horizontally, depending on where you want to add it. So I will go to the vertical in this case, and I'm going to click it once, and now I'll be able to slide this across the object and choose where it adds those extra faces. So I can click, and now we can see that we have new faces that we can select because I have added some vertices and edges at that point. All right, so kind of cool. And now we're adding more faces, which allows us to do more things. Now, within any 3D program, you want to have control over the objects that you're selecting. So if I wanted this piece to move out in a different direction, let's say I'm building a complex object, and I want this face to extrude, because that's the proper term, right out of this object. The shortcut in Blender is E. So when you press the E key, you are now able to extrude that single face from the rest of the mesh. Okay, and you can do the same thing with X and Y and Z. All right, if you don't want it to come perfectly straight out. And when you click, that has now added to the complexity of this object that we are trying to create. All right, so now you can see how we have created an entirely new, totally different object from the block. Now the cool thing about extrude is we can keep pressing E, and we can keep extruding. I'm just pressing E over and over and over again. And you can see how we can keep building this object off of any face we have into any shape we want. Okay, so you can see now I've totally changed that shape into a new object. And from this very simple principle, we can model very complex shapes, all right, using extrude. So that was loop cut and extrude with the E key and selection of faces. Very, very important. I want to show you a few other things. If we want to select an entire object at once, we could press A key, and you press it twice, and that will select everything on that object. So you can scale an entire object at once, or you could flip an object if you want. That's good for sizing. If you press the B key, you will get this selection, which is a box selection, which allows you to draw a box around the areas you want to select. And you notice that we are in face mode, so we are just selecting the faces in that area. If we want to select the points, we could switch to a different mode, and now it would select the points. All right, and just to deselect, you just click a point somewhere else and it'll deselect. Now I want to show you an issue that you're going to run into. Let's say you're using B for box select and you select these. Let's go to faces, we select these faces. Now we might start scaling this and changing it, but the problem is it has not selected the ones on the back side of the object. The reason for that is because right now we have an option that is basically telling it, don't select anything we can't see. And that little option is controlled right here. Okay, this is limit selection to visible. If we want to be able to select things that are also on the non-visible side, we click that, do the same thing with the box selection, and now both sides will become selected because now we can actually kind of see through it, which is a really nice feature. Now you'll probably want to turn that off and on depending on whether you want to use that. But it is a very handy feature for sure. Now let's say I want to select an object, and if I draw a box around it, let's say I just want this point and a few others, and I don't want all the rest of this. You'll see that that's very difficult to do with a box. So if I switch to vertex mode, the trick for that is to select one of the objects, hold the control key, and draw a selection around the area you want to select. Okay, that you can see is very easy to do. You just hold control, draw a selection, and that will select whatever's in that circle shape or whatever shape you create. Doesn't really matter. You can make it any shape you want, and it will only select what's in the inside of that selection. So those are the three selection types: A, all; B, box; control, selection. Okay, that gives you control over selecting the points and the faces and the edges that you need to work with. All right, so that's super handy. Now let's say we don't want to start with a primitive shape. Let's say we want to start with a custom shape right from the get-go, right from the start. What I would do is I would start, let's just get rid of this object altogether. Shortcut, I pressed A to select all, press X to delete. I chose vertices and it gets rid of it. Let's go back to object mode. Let's say I put a cube in here. This is how usually Blender will start, with a cube. I'm going to show you how to make a custom shape. All right, so let's say I don't want to use a cube as a starting point. What I can do is I can select the cube, go into edit mode with tab, press X to delete, and delete all the vertices. And I'm going to press 7 on the numpad to switch into top view. And now what I can do is I can hold control, and I can start clicking and creating a totally custom object just by clicking, clicking where I want those points to be. Now I'm doing a really bad hand here. All right, but you get the point that I can make complex objects like so. Now the trick to this is to not close off the last two. Instead, what you do is you press A twice to select it all, and then the shortcut is F to turn that into a face. All right, so now I just exited out of edit mode by hitting tab, and you can see I have created a face out of those points that I have made. And now if I use E in edit mode, let's just go to face, select the face, press E to extrude. You can see now that that object becomes an entirely new kind of complex, I mean, it's not super complex, but a totally custom shape that I didn't have to go and model block by block. So that's kind of a neat way to create more complex shapes. Now, as the final thing in this tutorial, because this is just the basics of modeling, let's say you're not a big fan of the blocky sort of look that Blender has as you're modeling, because it is just, you know, kind of square faces and you know, it looks very blocky. In a later lesson, we'll look at modifiers, but I'm just going to show you a really useful one that you can use right away. In the tabs over to the right-hand side, under the wrench is your Modifier Palette. If you click that, it's going to ask you to add a modifier. Now, I recommend going into object mode. Don't be in edit mode still. Go into object mode and add a modifier to this object. One that works really well is Subdivision Surface. And this one, this one is not looking too good. Oh, there we go, it's better. No, that's pretty bad. But what we can do here is we can smooth out the object, and you can see it's really not doing a good job at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually remove this modifier. But if I want something to look smooth, if I want something to look rounded out, I can use the smooth modifier to do that. And the cool thing about that is it still keeps its original shape. Like if I go into edit, I can still select all the individual points, but it just smooths out the edges on all of the shapes that you've created. And the more that you kind of bring up the render, oops, you know, this slider here with the view and the render, it's going to change the way that it blends. But I'll show you an even easier way. So if we go back out, I'll actually delete this modifier. If I select this and I go to Tools, and I go to Shading and I choose Smooth, you will see that it gives that appearance of a much smoother object. It smooths off the rough edges, makes it look a little more polished. And that's a really easy thing to set. Shading, Smooth, there you go. Now if you ever want to go back to the flat, you just hit Flat, and you get back to that really chunky, sort of blocky look that we had before. All right, well, hopefully that helps. Again, from this you can make ridiculously complex objects. This is kind of the basics of modeling more complex shapes, getting away from just using primitives. All right, so hopefully that helped. Till next time, thanks for watching.